Welcome students. I welcome you to the next unit of block 2, that is unit number 6, which is about sources of conflict. So in this unit what we are going to understand? We are going to understand about different types of sources of conflict. Then what are the different levels of social interaction at which conflict occurs? Then what are different variation of threat that happens in international conflicting situation? And finally, we are going to learn about the reasons which are behind the nature of the conflict that is happening in South Asia. In this unit number 6 of sources of conflict, we are going to understand about different types of sources of conflict, then different level of social interaction at which conflict is occurring, finally variation of threat that is happening in international conflicting situation, and finally you will understand about the reasons behind nature of conflicts that is happening in South Asia. So what are the sources of conflict? The sources of conflict can be divided in two categories. One is conflict because of issues and resources, and the second one is conflict because of interpersonal, intergroup, or because of other certain differences. So when we look at the sources of conflict under the category of issues and resources, so we have economic conflict, then we have value conflict, then we have power conflict, then conflict because of ineffective communication, and finally comes escalation of the conflict. So what comes under economic conflict? Like competing motives to attain scarce resources, means one party, country or region has abundance of resources, others having not. So conflict happens for overcoming or attaining those abundant resources by the parties having scarcity of the resources. Value conflict, the incompatibility in the way of life, ideologies, preferences, principles, practices they believe. Because of this the conflict arises, that comes under the category of value conflict. Finally, power conflict, when each party wishes to maintain or maximize the amount of influence over the other or exerts in the relationship or in any kind of social setting. So you can think of a situation of a power conflict. What is come under ineffective communication is miscommunication or misunderstanding. It is surprisingly because of miscommunication and misunderstanding also generate or create conflict even when there is no basic incompatibilities. Means you are the warring parties are not fighting for scarcity of resources or by exerting their values or perceptions or because of any other reasons, but the conflict is happening because of miscommunication and misunderstanding. So this conflict comes under ineffective communication. And finally, escalation of conflict, have a definite tendency to escalate. Such situation where there is a definite tendency to escalate, to become more intense and hostile like situation, to develop more issues. What are the parties say the conflict is about? So this is the condition of escalation of the conflict, and it happens because of economic issues, because of the value, because of the power, and because of ineffective communication. The second category of sources of conflict is based on interpersonal, intergroup, or other related differences. So first is interpersonal conflict, when two people have compatible needs, goals, or approaches in their relationship. Then interpersonal conflict bound to happen. Role conflict, this involves very real differences in the role definition, expectations, responsibilities between the individuals who are independent in a social system. One has a dominant role, other may not be having that dominant role. So because of the understanding of the role perception of the warring, or let's say two different parties which are involved in incompatible situation, then role conflict situation can arise. And then comes third is intergroup conflict. It occurs between collections of the people such as ethnic or racial groups or departments or levels of decision making in certain organization, union or management level, then this situation are basically conducive towards intergroup conflict. After intergroup, another broad version is multi-party conflict, when different interest groups, you can say kind of pressure groups and organizations, have varying priorities and resource management and policy development. When they have diverse of the opinion conflicting, then we can go for multi-party conflict. And finally comes international conflict. What happens under international conflict? It occurs between the states at the global level. Competition for resources, maybe two countries, one is with the abundance of resources, another is of the scarcity of resources, certainly plays a part. Both value and power conflicts are often intertwined and are sometimes predominate under such kind of situations. So we have seen that under the second category of sources of conflict, we have interpersonal conflict, then we have role conflict, then we have intergroup conflict, finally multi-party conflict, and leading up to the top level of international conflict. So what are the conflict based issues and resources? In the economic conflict involves competing motives to attain those resources which are under limited version. Each party wants to have most of these scarce resources. Behavior and emotions of each party directed towards maximizing its gain by taking maximum of those resources which are generally scarce at the level of the other party. Value conflict involves incompatibility in the ways of life of ideologies. And then international conflict such as Cold War, often a strong value component wherein each side asserts the rightness and superiority of its way of life and socio-economic and political system. Then these come under the value conflict situation. In power conflict occurs when each party wishes to maintain or maximizing the amount of influence that it exerts in the relationship in the social setting. Power conflict can also happen between groups and different nations whenever one or both parties choose to take over a power approach to in their respective relationship. When you try to exert a power kind of relationship between two nations, then situation which can become conducive for power conflict kind of situation. Power also enters into all conflict since the parties are attempting to overcome and showing their superiority position over the others. Now under ineffective communication is another important source of conflict because of miscommunication, misunderstanding can create conflict when there are no basic incompatibilities. Earlier we have seen that there are basic incompatibilities, then we can go and fight for the conflicting situation. But under ineffective situation, there are no basic incompatibilities, but conflict is arising because of miscommunication and misunderstanding. In addition, parties may have different perceptions. What are the to clarify their respective perception or resolutions, and which the other party is not able to understand. When the one side of the party is self-centered, selective perception, emotional bias, prejudice, all these things against the other parties, and all forces that lead to perceive situation very differently from the perspective of the other party, then also it is a kind of ineffective communication. It is a perceived difference. You can understand that ineffective communication is because of the perceived difference of the, or you can say a difference of perspective of the other party. So escalation of conflict is another major source of conflict. It is more additional than basic nature of conflict because it comes in after the conflicts had started. Conflicts have a definite tendency to escalate. Every conflict has all the basic tendency to escalate to the another level, or let's say it becomes more intense or hostile and develop more issues what the party says that conflict is it's about. Therefore, escalating conflict becomes more difficult to manage. Means when the conflict has not escalated to the level of, let's say, a war, a crisis kind of situation, then you can go for conflict management, you can try to manage the situation. But when it has escalated, then it is very difficult to manage. When the other party responds with a counter action, then it is perceived as justifying the initial precautionary measures, and new kind of action and spiral and counter action becomes mean conflict has already escalated to a level where it is going very difficult to manage by negotiating parties. Interpersonal, intergroup or difference based conflicts, you have seen that we have interpersonal conflict. Interpersonal conflict means conflict between two people having compatible need, goals and approaches in their relationship. In this case, what happens? Communication breaks down. An important source of interpersonal conflict is that communication gets break down. Learning communication skill is valuable. Means you should have a good communication skill to overcome, or you can prevent such kind of conflicting situation, and you can go for conflict resolution also when you have proper communication. At the same time, very real differences occur between people that cannot be resolved by any amount of improved communication. Now after interpersonal conflict, we have role conflict. So in role conflict, what happens? Very real differences in role definitions or role expectations or role responsibilities between individuals who are interdependent in a social system. So individuals who are interdependent in a social system, so kind of conflict that involves because of difference in role responsibilities, even role definition also, and role expectations also. So that can lead for role conflict kind of situation. What is intergroup conflict? In intergroup conflict, collections of people such as ethnic or racial groups or departments or levels of decision making in the same organization and union and management. Competition of scarce resources is also one of the common source of intergroup conflict, and societies have developed numerous regulatory mechanisms such as collective bargaining, mediation for dealing for less means such kind of conflict which is not disruptive as in the other escalated position of the conflict. Social and psychological measures are also very important in dealing with intergroup conflict, because group members tend to develop stereotypes, oversimplified negative beliefs about the other parties, and practice discrimination kind of tactics against the other group of the people or races or area concerning that kind of people or groups. After the intergroup conflict, there is multi-party conflict. Multi-party conflict occurs when societies, when different interest groups and organizations have very different set of priorities over resource management and policy development. Simple, suppose there is a water scarcity. There is scarcity for employment, good employment, scarcity for agriculture produces. So when multi-party conflict under condition of multi-party conflict, it happens in societies when different interest groups and organization, interest group like a kind of pressure groups, opinion makers, think tankers and organization, they have different set of priorities which are varying. One has for one group it may not be so important, but for the other group have a lot of importance, so they are giving preference to that priorities over resource management and policy development. Then it will lead to the situation of multi-party conflict. These conflicts typically involve combination of economic, value and power resources. Means you can say that under multi-party conflict, economic conflict can be the reason, value conflict could be one of the reason, and power conflict could be one of the reason. So these three conflicts come under multi-party conflict. In simple word, multi-party conflict can happen because of the economic related conflicts, because of the value related conflict and because of the power related conflict. So now after this multi-party conflict, let us reach to the another level of conflict that is known as international conflict. What happens in international conflict? It occurs between two countries or states at the global level. Competition for resources, certainly it is there. One country may be of scarcity of resources, one country can be of abundance of resources, so fight for the resources. Power conflict can also be one of the reasons between two different countries or states, means exerting the power of one country over the others or its neighbor. So this is known as power conflict. It also happens in international conflict. Differences are articulated through channels of diplomacy in a consistent and constant game of give and take. Threat, coercive diplomacy, counter threat, sometimes having what you can say that one country having abundance of military power, which is also creating conflict for the other countries. Mechanisms of propaganda can also lead to many of the some of the social psychological distortions, characteristic interpersonal intergroup conflict. One of the most striking differences between the conflict of the firms and the states is that competition of state is marked by dramatic alteration of the peace and war, and this alteration of two contrasted forms of conflict is, one is covert conflict of threat, means promises and pressures during peace, and overt conflict, which is just known as it is a kind of war in all the relations. So under international conflict you can have a covert conflict also and overt conflict. In covert conflict you can show threats, promises, pressures during the peace time, and overt conflict is oblique, is a condition of war. So overt covert pattern is a standard and almost regular cycle which is found in most developed and international relations, which comes under the international conflicting kind of situation. So now next is variants of threat in international conflict situation. One means which kind of different threat that are being utilized, used. So these we are going to study under this heading, that is variant of threat in international conflict. So first is threat of punishment, means under two unconditionally viable states or nation, a kind of threat of punishment is also one of the significant threat for threat to be used under international conflicting situation. And like a kind of infliction of punishment to create costly situation for a punisher, or quite apart from any retaliatory kind of action, threat of punishment is also that one country is threatening for retaliatory action because of the action of some other countries. So this is known as threat of punishment under international conflict. So it is a threat. Threat of punishment means perceived situation of getting punishment from the other country or state or the area group. The second is threat of conquest. The threat of conquering the nation becomes possible when a nation is no longer unconditionally viable. In the expansion of empires, means one country wants to extend its boundary, extend its area, so threat of conquest is also happening. The threat is not always of the conquest by dominant power. Sometimes it is of allowing the threatened countries to be conquered by a rival dominating power, means one country is threatening to another country, but it is not basically being conquest, it is being conquest by a rival dominant power. So it is also a threat of conquest. You are creating such a kind of situation that one country is going to conquest the others, but it is being conquered by some other dominant power. So these are threat of conquest. So in variation of the threat of international conflict, we have threat of punishment, we have threat of conquest, and then threat of annihilation. A threat system of its kind, especially when the powers of annihilation mutual, is intolerable and introduces a conflict of disparate instability in international relations. Then comes threat of offensive and defensive weapons. So military weapons can also be considered as one of the threats for offensive and defensive weapon. How? Let us take with the help of example, city wall, a bomb shelter. This is a kind of defensive weapon. A fighter plane of intermediate status, which main objective is to destroy the agents or enemy, is also known as defensive aspect. A bomber, the fighter plane, has two different kind of capacity. One is defensive. Defensive means the fighter plane is going and attacking on the enemy targets and destroying all those areas or items or any kind of weapons. So again, students, I repeat, the threats under international conflict. One is threat, in continuation is threat of annihilation, a kind of threat system of this kind, especially when the powers of annihilation mutual is intolerable and introduce a condition to disparate instability in international relations. So it is a kind of another threat under international conflict. Then weapons, both offensive and defensive, they can also be a kind of threat under international dispute. So let us first see defensive weapon, a kind of shield, city wall, a bomb shelter that is prepared in a country. These are defensive armaments for protection against any kind of external aggression by the enemy countries. Then we can have different weapons like a fighter plane. Fighter plane has two roles. One kind of fighter plane, its objective is to destroy the enemy targets or all those structures which can create any external aggression or problem in the respective countries. Another category of fighter plane is known as bomber or a missile, which is clearly offensive weapon designed mainly to injure the enemy, even though that it may have direct or indirect effects in weakening the enemy power. Means any enemy power which can injure on the other country, the particular country is sending the bomber and missile to destroy all those capabilities of enemy countries. Between offensive and defensive weapon, there is another mid-level arrangement. It is, or you can say, an intermediate reaction kind of situation, that is known as offensive defensive. What is offensive defensive? It aims to injure the threatening agent of the threatener, but not the threatener himself. And last, one more threat that comes under international dispute is boundary disputes. So what is boundary disputes? In international relations, the boundaries of the states tend to be very sharply defined, and any violation of the boundary is regarded as a matter of grave concern. And sometimes it also happens that boundary disputes are because of the perceived difference about the border. Two warring or enemy countries, they have dispute that the border line goes from one place to that place, which is not acceptable or perceived by the other parties or other country. So because of these perceived differences also in the boundary or the border area leads to disputes, and it can have all the possibilities of international conflict of very high level. So students, in this unit 6, what we have understood? We have understood different type of conflict. Conflict based off what? Based, there could be different type of conflict depending upon issues and resources and interpersonal, intergroup or differences. So in issues and resources, we have economic conflict, value conflict, power conflict, ineffective communication and escalation of the conflict. Under interpersonal, intergroup or differences, we have interpersonal conflict, we have role conflict, we have intergroup conflict, we have multi-party conflict, and finally we have international conflict. Then we have gone through in detail about all these conflicts, their issues and the resources which lead for the conflicts of both the categories. After this, we have understood in detail about a situation which lead to international conflict. So after having understanding about international conflict, we studied about what are the different variants which lead to threat in international conflicts. Under that, we have gone for understanding about threat of punishment, threat of conquest, and threat of annihilation, threat of offensive and defensive weapon, and finally boundary disputes. So all these deliberations summarize for our understanding in different kind of conflict, sources of conflict, their typology of the conflict, and related threats under international dispute and all other conflicts. With this, our unit number 6 is over, and we will be meeting in our next interaction, which will be based on unit number 7 of block number 2. Till then, bye, and we meet again. Thank you.